video of Risk Academy will present on the alternatives to risk maps. Before I hand over to Alex, again a short housekeeping announcement. As with our earlier presentation, this is very much an interactive 24 hours, and so we encourage you to ask our speakers as many questions as you so desire. And you can do this by clicking on the Q&A box, which you'll find in your Zoom toolbar. Again, our sessions will generally run 40 minutes on the hour, every hour, with a 20-minute break between each session at about 40 minutes past the hour. And with that, I will now hand over to Alex Sidorenko.
Hi, Kin, and thank you so much for the invitation. And hi, everyone watching us online. Do keep this interactive, ask questions. I'm more than happy to look in the chat window and answer them from time to time. So, while I am technically the creator of the Risk Academy blog and the Risk Academy YouTube channel, I have been doing a lot more than that in my risk management career. I have been working in risk as the head of risk for large organizations for the last 15 years. And even now, I'm acting as a chief risk officer in Switzerland, in one of the largest chemical mining companies in the world. So that's quite exciting. Opportunity for me to pilot test some of the wild ideas that I usually publish on my blog. And if you haven't seen it, do check out Google, Risk Academy. And if you look in the bottom left corner of the slide, and hopefully, and Keen, do please confirm that. Hopefully you actually see in the slide presentation, you don't see the PowerPoint window, but the actual presentation, like the front facing.
Yes, I can confirm that.
Okay, excellent. So in the bottom left corner, you can see Risk with the little logo, which I try to plug every opportunity I can. Risk Awareness Week has passed in October, and that was the biggest global risk event ever, because as of now 2,900 people from 121 countries have participated, and that had more than 57 workshops, and all of the workshops, all the replays are still available. And I'm very thankful for Strategic Risk being a partner in that conference and helping promote risk-based decision making any way we can. So today I wanted to take quite a narrow view, and I watched some of the presentations before. So my presentation will be much more narrow. There are a lot of things we can talk about in the risk management, but the one little challenge that I hope will unravel most of the kind of flaws in traditional risk management. I wanted to kind of just take that little straw and pull it out of this house of cards we call risk management, and maybe the whole thing will collapse, and who knows, we will live a happy life afterwards. So the topic of my presentation is the alternatives to heat maps. And the obvious question I get people asking is, well, do we even need one? And the other most common response I hear is that, well, it's just one of the tools in the toolbox, so who cares if we use it or not use it. Truth be told, it is still globally, probably the most common approach to analyze risk is by adding or multiplying. It actually doesn't matter, likelihood and consequences or impact, or some best practice consultants created other variables that you can add on top, like velocity or viscosity, or they keep coming up with nonsense. I lost track of it. And so the first kind of ultimate question is, well, should we even bother? It's one of many tools, and it's been around for ages, and it's well accepted. It's implied in ISO 31000. It's kind of implied in COSO ERM. It's in every single best practice brochure that you can find around. It's probably in 99.9% risk management books, if you just Googled and looked at the first 100 pages. Actually, speaking of books, me and a friend of mine, Elena Demidenko, a few years back wrote another risk management book, which actually promised to never mention heat maps, and that since became the most popular free risk management book on the planet. It has been downloaded over 100,000 times so far. So just Google free risk management book and it's #1 in Google. Enjoy, it's out there. It's available on different websites for free download, no registration, nothing. So the first question is, well, do we even bother? And I think the answer to this question has been given on so many different occasions that I think it is our risk management responsibility, both moral and ethical and just competency-wise. It's our responsibility to at least consider different kinds of research that suggests that when you apply a heat map to your identified risks, and when you're trying to make any kind of sensible conclusions out of that, or when you're trying to use that to drive mitigation effort, or when you're trying to implement the decision making, there is a lot of research, some is recent, some is quite old, a lot of research which suggests that you're actually better off not doing any risk analysis at all, because it's actually quite deceitful. And the most common excuse I hear to this normally is that, well, you just have to know how to use it properly. That is actually not true. The research suggests that there are implied methodological issues in first capturing risk as a single point instead of a range, in multiplying likelihood and consequences, in the way risk matrices or heat maps are structured, the way the bands are allocated, and the whole field of study in neuroscience, which suggests that people don't actually understand and don't mean likely or unlikely when they talk about probability. They usually mean something different. So all of this combined, kind of the probability theory plus the neuroscience research plus the decision science research over the last often more than 100 years suggests that all of these errors combined make this such a toxic technique that we're better off not using it at all. But don't trust me or on this. Specifically for you, and all of these slides will be available in LinkedIn, and I'm sure Strategic Risk will share it with the registrants as well. You should, as a competent risk manager, you should always challenge and backtest the quality of the techniques and the tools that you use. It's part of risk management. We always backtest just how accurate or how good our analysis was to begin with. So if you like reading scientific papers, then the first link is for you. It's available on ResearchGate, and it's written by 2 American and 1 Swedish scientists who worked extensively in oil and gas, and all of their conclusions are equally applicable to any industry, and it's called The Risk of Using Risk Matrices. That research is actually building upon a different research by a gentleman called Tony Cox, who's been doing a lot of analysis of risk techniques in agriculture and some of the other industries as well. So there's a lot of published scientific research which suggests that we should be conscious, at least careful, if not get rid of them completely. Now, if you don't like reading, or if you don't have a degree in mathematics and you probably wouldn't understand what the authors are trying to tell you, then you may prefer to watch a funny video. And a friend of mine, Osama Salah, who works in the Middle East, he did a very wonderful video summarizing that. Now, if you prefer to read a funny connotation and explanation of that, then another friend of mine, David Vossi, wrote a jokingly article on that. And if you like reading books, then Douglas Hubbard wrote a whole book called Why Risk Management is Broken, and that explains in a lot of detail, giving you a much detailed empirical testing on how people tried and it didn't work, and it probably won't work for you. So that's the quick introduction, and you don't have to agree with me, just do your own research. Heat maps are no different to horoscopes, and they're just as scientific and just as useful for decision making. So the good news is we have plenty of alternatives. And there are basically three key ingredients that we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about alternatives. Ingredient number one: for risk analysis to be useful, it has to be performed before a decision is taking place. So it has to, not on a quarterly basis, not on an annual basis, it has to be performed at the time of making a decision. So whatever the technique we use has to be easily integratable into the actual decision-making process. The second key ingredient is that the technique, instead of just telling us what the risk is and how significant the risk is, it should actually tell us how significantly that risk or a combination of risks would impact on the actual decision. So instead of saying we have this project and we have 5 significant risks, 5 high risks, the technique should allow us to say that we have a project, it promises to be finished in $1 million and in 6 months, and our risk analysis tells us that the actual cost would be significantly higher or lower, and the actual time frame for completion would be somewhere between 4 and 8 months. So that's the second important ingredient. Instead of talking about risk levels, we should be measuring how this uncertainty affects our objective or decision. And at the end of the day, that's actually the definition of risk in ISO 31000. And then the final ingredient is that the risk analysis technique should allow you to make changes to that decision before you actually make the decision. And we have dozens of techniques that satisfy those criteria. So we have more than a dozen techniques that are good enough. And let's just break them down further, because there are basically 2 buckets of techniques. The first bucket is techniques to better understand the nature of risk. And that helps us to make decisions about how we best manage that specific risk. For example, cyber. If for some bizarre reason, I don't know why you would, but if for some bizarre reason you want to understand, well, what is our cyber risk exposure and how do we treat that cyber risk exposure specifically, then we have techniques for that. But then the second group of techniques is actually much more useful. And just to give you an indication, I mean, this is probably like 20-80. For the blue type of techniques, you would use them 20% of the time. Ironically, this is what modern day risk managers are using 95% of the time. But it's really just 20% of the time. And then the purple risk techniques, they're the techniques that measure how uncertainty and risk affects a decision, budget, schedule, program, or anything that the business is actually thinking about. And the purple techniques, that we always talk about, risk managers should talk the business language, and this is what the purple techniques are for. They allow you to talk business language. Now let me show you examples. First, blue techniques, most of them I'm sure would be very familiar to you. And the good news is these techniques existed for decades. So there are textbooks and research papers on each of the techniques individually. Just start looking into them. You have to understand that all they do is they help you to understand the risk itself, not how the risk affects the business, but just the risk exposure, how much you're probably going to lose if this risk happens. And I mentioned cyber risk, but I didn't include it in the list of actual techniques. There is another technique using factor analysis, and it's called FAIR. And FAIR is quite a popular technique in cyber risk management. It's essentially using the same methodology that existed for the last 50 years. So these techniques are nice, but these techniques, the purple ones, are amazing. And this is what risk managers should really start using 80% of their time. This is where you should be dedicating your time. This is where you should be learning if some of these things look new to you, because none of them are. Most of those techniques existed for at least 50 years. Some techniques existed much longer. And I'll give you a link to a wonderful freely available document at the end of this presentation very shortly, just for you to kind of summarize all of that. So, some of the techniques, and I wanted to stop on some of the kind of the better ones. Key assumptions check is absolutely my favorite. And that's the technique, just so you understand how significant this stuff is. This is the technique that CIA and FBI officers have been using for the last few decades. And that's the only way they make decisions. Because when the cost of the decision or the cost of error is significant, when the uncertainty is significant, you have to improve decision making by applying those tools that appreciate uncertainty, that don't dumb down the uncertainty to a single number where impact is represented by one potential consequence and likelihood is represented by a single potential probability. In reality, every risk has a potential range of probabilities, every risk has a potential range of consequences. It really is a distribution. So key assumptions check is actually super simple. It's not mathematical. It's just a set of questions. You have to ask the decision makers, where are the assumptions coming from? Do they trust them? What if the assumptions change? What if the assumptions are volatile? And most of the time, of course, they are volatile. And then, if they are volatile, if you add volatility to those assumptions, you can either do sensitivity analysis or scenario analysis, or you can run a simulation. And running simulations has been the norm for decision making, for uncertain decision making, since 1946. And I'll talk a little bit about the whole innovation and big data and artificial intelligence in a second. But just note, I don't even mention big data. I don't even mention artificial intelligence, because these are very populist and consulting kind of bullshit typey concepts, because in reality, artificial intelligence is just a slightly more complicated decision tree, or it's a neural network, which is again a tool that existed since 1960s. Or a Monte Carlo simulation that we run on budgets or project schedules or investment decision making to calculate NPV. That existed, as I mentioned, since 1946. So every single technique that I'm mentioning has been around probably longer than most of us listening to this webinar have lived. And before we start being arrogant, and I just came back from a conference, large conference, risk management conference in Europe, and my God, risk professionals are arrogant. We keep talking about highly complicated mathematical concepts without realizing they're actually mathematical, or they're complicated, or the fact that we've actually used a simpler, probably as good mathematical concepts in the past. So don't jump on the bandwagon. Risk management as of today, and I mean I'm making a very, very kind of high level statement here, but 99% of the problems risk managers can and should solve for their businesses can be fixed using the techniques that are at least 50 years old. And this is just a very simple Pareto rule. Don't chase the innovation unicorn just because this is what everyone talks about. Solve the problems, improve the decision quality within your businesses using the techniques that have been available for decades. The trouble is, you do need an understanding of decision science, you do need an understanding of probability theory, and you do need an understanding of neuroscience. Because all of these sciences that probability theory is 500 years old, decision science is more than 100 years old, and neuroscience is close to 50 years old. You do need those fundamental skills to be able to apply proper risk management. And I wanted to, as a chief risk officer at a large company, when I started, I was told exactly the same as I think most of us are told. We don't have risk management, we need to build it from scratch, and I have a big job ahead of me. That is not true. I mean, not even close. The irony is that while we in the risk management department are using outdated, prehistoric, fundamentally flawed techniques like heat maps, other business units have been using proper risk analysis forever. They just never called it risk management. For example, procurement has always used scoring. Finance and treasury have always used scoring for credit management. They've always used simulations and scenarios for market risk. Strategy department uses scenario analysis, which is a risk management technique. It's a purple risk management technique. I showed it to you just now. It's a very good purple risk management technique. So strategy department has been using it for ages. Investment teams have been running sensitivity analysis on their NPV and IRR calculations for years. Market research have been using simulations. Oil and gas exploration is all simulation based. I mean, even doctors use decision trees. It is amazing how much wonderful risk management we have around us, while we're being bogged down by a tool that is inferior to what the business is using. So I just find this absolutely ironic, is that we position ourselves as the center of competencies for dealing with uncertainty, and yet we are worse at dealing with uncertainty than most other existing departments. So I think, if we are talking about innovation in risk management, and coming back to the theme of today's series of workshops, if our theme is changing risk, well, make risk management great again, as Donald Trump would say, and make the risk management team the center for competencies for probabilistic decision making, for using probabilistic techniques to improve the quality of decision making, to improve the quality of planning, forecasting, investment decision making, and literally anything that has to do with uncertainty. Because all the business units have been using it for years, but when you start digging deep inside, you realize that the way strategy department applies scenario analysis is actually not methodologically sound. They actually make a lot of mistakes. The way investment teams apply sensitivity analysis is actually not methodologically sound. They specifically hide risks from the decision makers. And that's, at the end of the day, that's the job that risk managers have. Make uncertainty visible. Make uncertainty clear. Make the decision makers appreciate that certain decisions about the future, most of the decisions about the future probably, are highly uncertain. And pretending that there is a single scenario is that, pretending that the foreign exchange next year, sometime in December, will be 1.2 is insane, because there's absolutely zero chance it will be 1.2. It will be somewhere around that, but it is highly volatile. Most of the things in business are highly volatile, and we should bring kind of the appreciation for volatility back into the decision making. And that's essentially what I'm doing right now. And earlier today there were sessions on how to communicate with decision makers and C-suite and the board, and it's really simple. It's really simple. You just talk about adding volatility and making decision making probabilistic. I don't even mention the word risk, and for some bizarre reason, I don't know. Obviously, it's not a representative sample. I've only talked to executives recently in one company where I work, but all of them immediately get it. And what's more embarrassing, they immediately say, "Oh, thank God we're not going to update our quarterly risk report, because what a waste of time that was." So use this opportunity. If you are going to change risk management, don't wait for a magic pill for artificial intelligence to solve anything. I mean, if you don't have a degree in mathematics, you're probably not going to ever understand artificial intelligence anyway, until it becomes commoditized like electricity, and it is just delivered. You pay for it as a subscription service. You're never going to do it yourself anyway. So go back to the history of decision making in military, medicine, pharmaceuticals, oil and gas, engineering, and just apply the same techniques all these wonderful professions have been applying when they were making uncertain decisions. And I remember coming to a high-tech conference and walking past a room of engineers, and they were discussing the new design for an engine, for a plane engine, new generation of plane engines. And they were non-stop talking about how they apply Monte Carlo simulation to simulate different aspects of the design and see whether, if it's a robust and sustainable design. And then I continue walking, and I walk into the room where the risk workshop is happening, and there are people arguing whether it should be 3x3 or 5x5 risk matrix. So, I think it's about time we stopped embarrassing ourselves if we claim to be the center of competencies for the uncertainty and volatile and probabilistic decision making. And since the science of decision making and probabilistic decision making is much, much older than the idea of risk management as a corporate governance element, and I want you to understand this very, very clearly, heat maps are less than 30 years old, and they were created by consultants who were selling horoscopes. There's no science behind them, and it developed in absolute parallel universe to the actual science of decision making and science of dealing with uncertainty. So you have to be very conscious of that. So since the actual science is much, much older than risk management modern day theory, then all you really have to do is, instead of reading risk management books, with the caveat, we've tried to make our free risk management book not about risk management. We actually try to build it upon a scientific base. Open any book on decision science or probability theory, and there you will find all these amazing techniques that can become the new common go-to tool in the risk management community. And just to give you an example, at the bottom of this slide, I shared a link. This is a link to a summary document prepared by CIA, which is a secret service in US, prepared by CIA in 2009. And this is a summary of the techniques, of the risk analysis techniques that CIA analysts are using and have been using for the last, since it's published in 2009, you can imagine they have been using it for years before it kind of became non-secret and they were releasing it to the public. So have a look at that wonderful document published by CIA 10 years ago, or to a wonderful book written by a Stanford professor, Sam Savage, called Flaw of Averages and Why We Cannot Continue Using Heat Maps, or a wonderful book, The Failure of Risk Management by Douglas Hubbard. Both of these books have been published more than 10 years ago, and they both talk why they give you extensive empirical evidence. Empirical evidence is when someone has a theory, a hypothesis, he goes away and tests it for many, many, many years, and then he comes with a conclusion. So, and for you as the risk manager, there's always a choice. You can either trust somebody else's conclusions, or you can do your own empirical testing. But ignoring science is absolutely insane. And I just wanted to finish on that. Let me move on to questions, and let me see if I can quickly respond.
Great, Alex, thank you very much for your insightful and candid presentation. It certainly got me in the mood to challenge the status quo and tradition. I want to kick off the Q&A session with a rather broad question, just to warm things up. And that is the industry, or the risk management community rather, ready to drop risk maps entirely?
So, sorry, did you say, is the industry ready?
Yes. Is the risk community ready to drop risk maps entirely?
Well, I mean, in kind of in the continuation of the candid chat, I don't think we should really care what the risk community is ready or not ready for. The business certainly is. The average time span for a risk manager in the company is not long. The value of the perceived value of risk management by the decision makers is ridiculously low. The status of most risk managers in the industry is not high. The surveys, I mean, even the rubbish surveys that some of the risk management institutes are running, even those surveys tell us that there is a general dissatisfaction with risk management. So the business is sending a very, I mean, they have been sending this clear message for the last 5 years. They're saying, whatever you guys are doing is not good enough. It's not actually helping us. So it's really individual choice. Do you kind of want to continue doing what doesn't work, and there's scientific evidence that it doesn't work and it never worked, and there's absolutely nothing you can do to make it work? So it's really an individual choice whether you want to continue down that path or you want to start looking into kind of parallel streams. And I think that's the biggest challenge. For the last 30 years, risk management has been developing, like risk community or risk profession, has been developing in this vacuum ignorant of the last 500 years in probability theory, last 100 years in decision science, and last 50-something years in neuroscience. So, there's a very finite opportunity for a profession to develop in the vacuum. And sooner or later, the vacuum will break, and we'll lose, hopefully, a lot of risk managers who have been kind of ignoring those parallel streams of research for years. So, are they ready? I mean, given that they're probably more ready than they ever were, if that's any consolation. I mean, we've run Risk Awareness Week, and that has a huge turnout. I mean, people are clearly interested, and the feedback is amazing. You've been running Changing Risk campaign for what, close to a year now, probably, maybe even more. And that clearly is engaging people's attention. So I think, for those risk managers that are honest with themselves, they feel deep inside that something's not right. Well, the good news is, there's scientific evidence that kind of explains what is not right. And the simple answer is it's definitely not right. In fact, it's actually very, very wrong what we are doing. And we have all these amazing opportunities. Just stop reading risk management books and start reading decision science books, and you'll discover that all the answers have been there for the last God knows how many years.
So I guess we need a new reading list, which you've kindly shared at the beginning of your presentation. Alex, just a point that I picked up on in your answer there was that risk managers, and I'm paraphrasing here, but risk managers, aren't seen as decision makers. Risk management isn't an elevated role. And just to tie that into your presentation, you had made the point earlier that we've got to make risk management the center of probabilistic techniques and decision making, and in fact anything to do with uncertainty. But what's your view on how the risk community at large can become front and center?
In terms of driving probabilistic decision making, you mean?
Yeah, but crucially being recognized as a professional that can help make more incisive decisions. Sure.
And I don't think there's, the first short answer is there's no amazing solution. Like, AI is not going to come and solve anything. If anything, it will complicate the math even more. And if risk managers can't use a decision tree today, they have absolutely zero chance of being able to properly apply more advanced mathematics. So the step number one is either upskill or leave the profession. At the end of the day, I mean, we have this free free reign of people in risk being, of having a large community of people calling themselves risk managers, but not really having the competencies to be risk managers in the first place. Because if you don't have a background in stats, mathematics, corporate finance, and a little bit of psychology, you're pretty much, unfit, professionally unfit to fulfill your risk management obligation. And this is super hard for many people to hear. The good news is it doesn't have to be a single person, like it's not a one-man show. You can have people in your team who are good at corporate finance, who are people who are good at statistics, good at financial modeling, good at psychology. It doesn't have to be a single man show, but the reality is a risk management team that doesn't have the competencies that I've just mentioned, which is probability theory, decision science, neuroscience, corporate finance, and understanding of the business, is pretty much useless to the business, apart from the corporate governance role where they just generate colorful reports for the board and the audit committee and the regulators and banks and insurance companies. So first step is upskill yourself or bring someone in the team. And then the second step, which is the most important one, is once you're comfortable that you have what it takes to actually deliver, because you can't sell something if you can't deliver afterwards. I mean, that's bad risk management. Then you start talking to each of the decision makers, trying to understand where the significant decisions are happening. And it's actually it's really that simple. Investment decisions are always happening. They are super uncertain and highly probabilistic. For any kind of forecasting is highly probabilistic. Any kind of budgeting or business planning is highly probabilistic. Any kind of pricing decision or estimation is highly probabilistic. You just have conversations with all of those individuals responsible for these areas and offer to them that instead of them running their own scenarios, they can outsource that scenario analysis to the risk team, and the risk team can do it methodologically and technologically quicker and better. That's the approach I've been taking for the last probably 7 or 8 years. You come to the decision makers and say, explain how the decision quality can be improved using better probabilistic techniques, and then offer them to do it for them, or at least offer to create a methodology and a template so they can do it themselves. Some businesses choose to do their own risk analysis, and that's absolutely fine as long as somebody checks the quality afterwards, internal auditors or someone else. So that's the approach. Upskill, be comfortable about the competencies that you're bringing to the table, and then talk to the decision makers, offering them your internal services. Because you essentially, risk managers are back office. They're service providers to the decision makers. And you're offering a service to add volatility and use probabilistic techniques to the decision making that they do. Just like tax department offers their services to calculate tax implications and work out the best tax structure. Well, risk managers are offering to calculate the risks and risk implications and offer the best risk-reward structure or balance for the decision makers.
Excellent. I'm going to try and squeeze in a few more questions from the audience, and sticking with the theme of decisions. A question from the audience. There are many decisions taking place and projects under discussion each day. Some, when taken individually, might decrease risk, but when taken as a whole, destroy value. So, how do you know you are making the right decision at the right time?
That's, it's probably a much bigger question that I can answer quickly, but my approach, and this is a new hypothesis that I'm yet to test, so I don't know if it's actually going to work out, but my approach is, it's actually a much better idea to think about each decision individually at the time of making a decision and trying to make that decision probabilistic. So instead of having this kind of holistic, enterprise-wide approach to risk management in general, my strategy has been, why don't we take one decision, one process at a time, change that and see how that kind of, bottom up essentially, instead of top down, and see how that works out. Since I don't think anyone has ever done one or the other, we don't know which one is better. But my hypothesis is that instead of thinking about are we making right decisions, right time, in the right location, it's why don't we just approach it? Let's try and make as many important decisions probabilistic as we can. And by doing that, we will kind of reach to a conclusion that some decisions are not right. Some decisions should not be done now and should be done in a different time frame. And maybe we are, we are making a wrong decision at all. Because when you apply probabilistic risk analysis, one of the conclusions often is that you probably shouldn't be making that decision in the first place. So anyway, I thank Adrian for this question. It's probably too big for me to answer it succinctly in words, but I did promise to write an article where I already thought of the name of the article, and it was something, implementing ERM is actually bad risk management. So I will do my best to try and kind of respond to that question in the article and get my message across there.
Excellent, thank you so much, Alex. I am going to try and squeeze you for one more answer to this question from the audience, which is, will it be a good thing if a risk analyst implements data scientist skills, for example, those related to having knowledge about AI for decision making? So you touched upon AI earlier, and if you could just explore that further.
Absolutely. And data science is a kind of a branch of decision science. It's kind of it's continuation of probability theory, decision science, and all the different research groups. So I mean, that's potentially it's a little bit of a hot topic at the moment. So I'm not sure whether there's a lot of kind of substance behind it. But the simple answer is yes, of course, it will be a good thing. If risk analysts understand the decision science, the probability theory, plus the data science, because there's a huge overlay between those sciences. Of course, that's exactly what I'm trying to say. That if you want risk management to be the center of competencies for probabilistic decision making, you have to understand the underlying mathematical sciences behind it, and that's data science is one of them. So yes.
Excellent. Alex, I am going to break all the rules here, and I know I'm sort of stretching things a bit with timing, but one last question from the audience, and then we'll round up. So typically, why do organizations shy away from leveraging risk management during strategic planning stage? This is a much broader question, but it would be good to have your insight.
Yeah, sure. I'll try and answer it as quickly as possible. First, I'll answer the second part. Yes, there are good books. Patrick McNeil wrote a huge textbook on strategic risk management, and it's all about adding uncertainty to assumptions, setting up correlations, and running simulations. Why do many organizations shy away? Two reasons. The people responsible for strategic planning are not competent. They have not competent in probabilistic decision making and planning and forecasting. You would be amazed, have a conversation with anyone in your strategy department. You would be amazed at how horrible they run scenario analysis. And scenario analysis being like one of the kindergarten techniques for us in our kind of risk portfolio. They simply don't know how. They have no idea that you can run a simulation where instead of testing 3 scenarios, you can test 10,000 scenarios in the same amount of effort. So this is why we need risk management. We need someone who understands how to add volatility to assumptions, to come in and teach the strategic department how to do proper probabilistic analysis on the strategy. That's one. And the second one is politics. Sometimes strategy is not kind of economically driven. It's political. And it's a fight between people for power, and it's a fight between management and the board and the shareholders. Sometimes risk analysis would highlight scary results, and nobody wants to show that. So they kind of they keep the strategy simple because it's not a real kind of decision-making document necessarily. So at least that's the short answer. But obviously this deserves a much longer answer where I'll maybe write another article on that.
Excellent, Alex. Thank you so much for taking the time to present today. I'm afraid that does bring us to the end of this session. But just to add that both Alex and Adrian Clements, who spoke earlier, are both very active on LinkedIn, and so if you would like to continue the conversation, do seek them out on